"You have 5 minutes to leave this property," the HOA president said while standing inside my private gate, holding a folder she believed gave her authority over my home. I looked at the woman standing in front of my $74 million lake estate and realized she had no idea what she had just started. "My name is Daniel Carter, and this lake property has been in my family's records for decades. It is not just a house overlooking the water. It is a place built on history, careful ownership records, and generations of responsibility. I had always respected the nearby community, even though my estate existed outside the main neighborhood boundaries. For years, there had never been a serious issue. That changed when Victoria Whitmore became the president of the local homeowners association. She was known as someone who believed rules created order, and many residents respected her confidence. But recently, her attention turned toward my property. First came letters about community standards. Then came requests about access to parts of my land. I responded politely each time and asked for the official documents supporting those claims. None were provided. Then, one afternoon, Victoria arrived with 2 HOA representatives and walked through my private entrance as if the decision had already been made. She placed a notice on my table and told me the HOA had determined that my estate had to comply with their authority. Most people would have reacted immediately. They would have argued, demanded answers, or allowed frustration to take control. I did something different. I picked up the document, read every line, and asked one question. "Where is the recorded agreement that gives the HOA control over my property?" Victoria looked confident at first. She explained that the community maps and development plans supported their position. But maps are not ownership records. Plans are not legal rights. And assumptions do not replace signed agreements. That evening, I went through every document connected to my estate. I reviewed the original deed, property surveys, and historical records my family had preserved over the years. Everything showed the same thing. My ownership was clear. The HOA had never been granted authority over my land. But while reviewing those files, I found something unexpected. A reference appeared in an older planning document that connected my estate to a future lakeside development project. It was not an agreement. It was only a proposal. Yet somehow, that proposal had become the foundation for the HOA's actions. I started looking deeper. The more records I reviewed, the more questions appeared. Why was the HOA so certain they could control my property? Why did they believe I would simply accept their decision? And why did their documents keep referring to a future project that required access through my estate? The next morning, I contacted the county records office and requested every document connected to the surrounding development plans. I expected to find a simple misunderstanding. Instead, I discovered the first sign that this was never just about HOA rules. Someone had been planning around my property for years, and someone had forgotten one important detail. They never actually had my permission. The morning after Victoria Whitmore entered my estate and demanded that I leave, I drove to the county records office with one goal: find the document she believed gave the HOA control over my property. I was not looking for a confrontation. I was looking for facts. When you own a property with decades of history, the paperwork tells a story that opinions cannot change. The clerk helped me review every record connected to my lake estate, including ownership transfers, boundary surveys, access agreements, and historical planning documents. At first, everything looked exactly as I expected. My family's ownership was clear. The property boundaries had remained unchanged. There was no recorded agreement giving the HOA authority over my land. Then I found something unusual. A development map from several years earlier showed my estate marked as a key location for a future lakeside expansion project. The map was not a legal document, but someone had treated it like one. The more I examined the records, the more I noticed a pattern. The HOA had repeatedly referred to this future project as if it was already approved. They had spoken about access routes, community improvements, and shared lake facilities, but none of those plans included the one thing they actually needed: my permission. That discovery changed the way I viewed Victoria's actions. She was not simply enforcing a neighborhood rule. She was protecting a plan that depended on something my family had never agreed to. I returned home and reviewed the notice she left behind. Hidden in the language was a reference to an old community development agreement. It was mentioned several times, but there was no copy attached. That immediately raised another question. If this agreement was so important, why had nobody shown it to me? I contacted my attorney and requested a complete search of county and municipal records for any document connected to that agreement. 2 days later, the results arrived. There was a record of discussions between developers and the HOA, but there was no final agreement involving my property. Instead, I found notes from early planning meetings where my estate was described as the critical connection point for the proposed expansion. That phrase stood out. My property was not just another piece of land near the project. It was the piece that made the entire plan work. Suddenly, the reason behind the pressure became much clearer. The HOA was not focused on a minor rule dispute. They were trying to solve a much larger problem for a development plan that depended on my cooperation. But one question remained unanswered. Who had convinced Victoria that she could enter my property and order me out? That evening, while organizing the documents, I found an email reference from an old HOA archive that mentioned a legal review conducted years earlier. The review had been completed before Victoria became president, and the file number suggested someone had already examined the exact issue I was now investigating. The next morning, I requested that file. What I discovered inside would reveal that the HOA may have known about their limits long before they ever came to my gate. The legal review file arrived 3 days after I requested it, and I immediately noticed something unusual. The document was not a complaint, a warning, or a dispute record. It was a private legal assessment created years earlier when the Lakeside Development Project was first discussed. I opened the file expecting to find another explanation for the HOA's confidence. Instead, I found something that changed everything. The review clearly stated that my estate was privately owned and that any future access would require a voluntary agreement with the property owner. The conclusion was simple. The HOA could discuss plans, but it could not create authority that did not exist. Someone had already answered the question Victoria Whitmore seemed so certain about. The HOA knew the limits. They had just chosen to act as if those limits did not matter. I continued reading and found another important detail. The legal review had been shared with several members of the HOA board before Victoria became president. It was not hidden information. It was part of the organization's history. That discovery created a new mystery. If previous leaders understood the situation, why did the current HOA leadership believe they could walk into my estate and demand control? I decided the best way to find out was not through assumptions. I requested a meeting with Victoria and asked her to bring every document the HOA used to justify its actions. When we met, she arrived with confidence and several folders. She explained that the HOA had spent years working on a vision for the lake community, and believed my estate needed to be part of that future. I listened carefully, then placed the legal review document on the table. I asked her if she had ever seen it before. For the first time, her expression changed. She admitted she knew there had been older discussions but claimed she believed the situation had evolved over time. That answer revealed something important. Victoria was not relying on a new legal agreement. She was relying on the belief that years of planning had somehow created a right that never existed. I asked one final question. If the HOA knew an agreement was required, why was I treated as if the decision had already been made? She did not answer directly. Instead, she explained that many residents expected the development to move forward and that delays were creating frustration throughout the community. That was the moment I understood the real pressure behind everything. This was not only about a property dispute. It was about a timeline. The developers had announced future improvements, residents were expecting changes, and the HOA needed my estate to complete the plan. Later that week, I received notice that the county would hold a public hearing regarding the proposed lakeside expansion. The hearing was scheduled for 14 days later, and both the HOA and developers would present their arguments. I knew that meeting would determine whether the project continued or collapsed. But before I could prepare, another message arrived from someone I had never met. The sender was a former HOA board member, and the first sentence immediately caught my attention. "I was there when they were warned about your property." The message from the former HOA board member arrived the next morning, and I read it carefully before deciding how to respond. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she explained that she had served on the HOA board several years before Victoria Whitmore became president. She said she had watched the lakeside development discussions grow more aggressive over time, and she had always believed someone needed to explain what really happened behind the scenes. We agreed to meet at a quiet location away from the neighborhood because she wanted to share documents she had kept from her time on the board. When Sarah arrived, she brought a small folder filled with meeting notes, emails, and planning records. She placed them on the table and told me something I did not expect to hear. "The HOA knew your estate was protected before they ever approached you." Inside the folder was a timeline of meetings that changed my understanding of the entire situation. The first discussions about the development were not focused on community rules. They were focused on creating a premium lakeside area that required access through my property. The developers had identified my estate as the ideal connection point because of its location along the water. The problem was simple. They needed my agreement. Sarah showed me meeting notes where board members discussed different ways to approach my family. Some wanted to negotiate directly and fairly. Others believed the HOA could create enough pressure through community rules that I would eventually cooperate. Then I found the document that explained why Victoria had been so confident. A former HOA attorney had warned the board that private ownership rights could not be changed through association policies. The recommendation was clear. Any access arrangement would require a voluntary agreement with me as the property owner. But that advice was followed by another set of notes showing that the board decided to continue promoting the development plan anyway. The more I reviewed the documents, the more the pattern became clear. The HOA was not trying to remove me because I violated a neighborhood rule. They were trying to solve a problem created by their own planning decisions. They had announced a future that depended on my cooperation before they ever received it. Sarah explained that she eventually left the board because she disagreed with the way the situation was being handled. She said many residents were excited about the development and trusted the leadership to provide accurate information. They never saw the legal concerns behind the project. That was the part that bothered me most. The issue was no longer just about my estate. It was about a community making decisions without knowing the complete story. Before we left, Sarah gave me one final document. It was a preliminary development map showing the full scope of the project. My estate was marked as the central access point for the lake expansion. Without my property, the entire plan would need to be redesigned. The county hearing was now only days away, and I finally understood why the HOA had taken such a strong position. They did not simply want my cooperation. They needed it. But as I prepared for the hearing, another question remained unanswered. If they knew they needed my permission, why did they believe they could force me to give it? The county hearing was only 3 days away when the HOA finally revealed the argument they believed would protect their position. Victoria Whitmore sent a formal notice to my attorney explaining that the association intended to present historical community agreements, development plans, and resident expectations as evidence that my lake estate should be included in the expansion project. When I read the notice, I immediately recognized the strategy. They were not presenting a new ownership document because one did not exist. They were presenting years of discussions and hoping those discussions would appear stronger than the actual property records. I spent the next several days preparing every document connected to my estate. I organized the original deed, boundary surveys, historical records, and the legal review that confirmed my rights. I also included the documents Sarah Mitchell had provided, because they showed something more important than a disagreement. They showed that the HOA had received warnings before making its decisions. On the morning of the hearing, the county building was filled with residents, HOA representatives, and members of the development team. Victoria arrived with confidence and presented the situation as a simple community issue. She explained that the lake expansion would bring improvements, increase property values, and benefit everyone nearby. Many residents listened carefully because they had only heard the positive side of the project. Then my attorney asked the question that changed the entire discussion. Can the HOA provide any recorded document showing that this property is subject to their authority? The room became quiet. Victoria's attorney presented several documents, including old planning materials and community maps. They looked official at first, but when the county officials reviewed them, the difference became clear. These documents described goals, expectations, and future possibilities. They did not create ownership rights. They did not create access rights. They did not change the boundaries of my estate. One county official asked whether the HOA had ever obtained a signed agreement from my family. The answer was no. That single answer changed how everyone viewed the situation. The issue was no longer about whether my property could support the development. The issue was whether the development had been planned around an assumption that was never legally confirmed. Then my attorney presented the internal HOA records showing that previous leadership had received legal advice explaining the same limitation years earlier. Victoria looked through the documents carefully, and for the first time, she appeared to understand how serious the situation had become. The county review officer paused the hearing and requested additional records from both the HOA and the developer before making a final decision. As everyone prepared to leave, I believed the biggest questions had finally been answered. But before I reached my car, my attorney received an email from the county office. Attached was a new document discovered during the review. It was an approval record connected to the original development plan, and it contained a signature from someone who had certified information that may not have been accurate. The hearing was no longer just about whether the HOA had authority. Now the county needed to know who approved a project based on rights that never existed. The discovery of the approval record changed the entire direction of the review. Until that moment, the main question was whether the HOA had misunderstood its authority. Now the county needed to determine whether the original development process had been built on information that was never properly verified. My attorney requested every related document connected to the approval, and the county review team began examining the history behind the project. Within days, more information appeared. The approval record showed that the development team had submitted plans based on expected cooperation from my estate. The problem was that expected cooperation was never the same as a legal agreement. Someone had taken a possible future arrangement and treated it as if it was already guaranteed. I returned to my own records and reviewed everything again, looking for anything my family might have missed over the years. That was when I found an old letter written by my father decades earlier. It was not about the current dispute. It was a simple note explaining why our family always kept detailed records of every property decision. He believed that ownership was not protected by wealth or reputation. It was protected by clear documentation. That reminder helped me stay focused as the pressure increased. The HOA responded by releasing a public statement explaining that they believed they had acted in good faith. Victoria Whitmore said the association had relied on information passed down from previous leadership and never intended to create conflict with my family. I understood that possibility. Not every mistake comes from bad intentions. But good intentions do not replace legal rights. The county scheduled another review meeting, and this time both the HOA and the developer were required to answer specific questions about the missing agreements. During the meeting, the developer representative admitted that the project team had known my approval was necessary. They explained that they believed the HOA would successfully reach an agreement with me before the final stages of development. That statement revealed something important. The developer knew there was uncertainty, but the project continued anyway. Then the county officials presented another finding. The original planning records contained notes from a legal consultation that advised everyone involved to obtain written permission from my family before moving forward. The advice had been available years earlier, but it was never included in the information presented to residents. The room became quiet as everyone understood what had happened. The problem was not simply a missing document. The problem was that important information had been ignored because it complicated the future plans. As the meeting ended, the county announced that a formal decision would be issued after one final review of the records. I thought the investigation had finally reached its conclusion, But later that evening, Sarah Mitchell contacted me again. She said she had found one more document from her time on the HOA board. She believed it could answer the biggest remaining question: who first decided that my estate could be treated as part of the community plan without my agreement? The document Sarah Mitchell found was waiting for me the next morning, and when I opened it, I immediately understood why she believed it was important. It was a private meeting summary from years earlier, created before Victoria Whitmore became HOA president. The notes described the first serious discussions about the Lakeside expansion project, and one sentence stood out more than anything else. The board members had written that my estate was privately owned and that any future plans involving the property would require direct approval from my family. The truth had been known from the beginning. The challenge was not discovering the facts. The challenge was understanding why those facts had been ignored. I reviewed the document several times and noticed another important detail. The person who pushed the expansion forward was not Victoria. It was a former project committee leader who believed the development would become one of the most valuable lake communities in the area. Victoria had inherited a plan that was already moving, but she also inherited the responsibility to verify the information behind it. Instead, she trusted old assumptions and continued forward. The county scheduled the final review meeting, and this time the atmosphere was completely different. The HOA arrived prepared with explanations, but the county officials already had the complete timeline. They reviewed the original planning records, the legal warnings, the internal HOA notes, and the documents showing that my permission had never been obtained. When Victoria spoke, she explained that she believed she was protecting the interests of the community. She said many residents had invested their hopes in the project and expected the leadership to find a solution. I listened carefully because I understood something important. She was not simply a person trying to win an argument. She was someone who had become committed to a plan without fully understanding the limits of her authority. Then the county review officer asked a question that changed the entire meeting. When did the HOA first learn that this property required separate approval? The room became silent. The answer was found in the old records. The HOA had known years earlier. That moment changed the way everyone viewed the situation. The issue was no longer about a misunderstanding between neighbors. It was about decisions made after critical information had already been provided. The county announced that the development approval would be paused until the property rights issue was fully resolved. The residents who had supported the project now had new questions. They wanted to know why they had never seen the complete information. As people left the meeting, Victoria approached me quietly. She admitted that she had believed the documents given to her represented the full story. She asked why I never agreed to become part of the project. I told her the answer was simple. I was never against improvement or cooperation. I was against decisions being made about my property without my involvement. The final county decision was still pending, but one thing had already changed. The HOA no longer controlled the story. The records did. And there was still one final document the county had not reviewed, a document that could determine whether the original development approval would be completely reconsidered. The final county review meeting was approaching, and for the first time since this dispute began, I felt the pressure shifting away from my family and toward the people who had made decisions without complete information. The missing document mentioned at the end of the previous review was finally located, and it revealed another important part of the story. It was a communication between the original development group and the HOA board from years earlier. The message clearly stated that the project could not move forward without a voluntary agreement from the owner of my lake estate. The requirement had never changed. The rules had never changed. Only the assumptions had changed. When the county officials reviewed the document, they immediately recognized the significance. The development plan had been built around a possibility, not a confirmed right. The HOA had treated a future hope as if it was already guaranteed. That distinction affected everything. Victoria Whitmore attended the final meeting with a different attitude than before. She no longer arrived with the same confidence she had shown when she first entered my property. She had reviewed the documents and understood that the situation was more complicated than she originally believed. During the meeting, she explained that she had relied on information passed down through previous leadership. She admitted that she never personally reviewed the earliest legal concerns before moving forward with the project. The county officials listened carefully, but they also focused on responsibility. Leadership decisions are based on verification, not assumptions. The county then presented the complete timeline. They showed when the HOA first discussed the project, when legal concerns were raised, when the development team created future plans, and when my property became the central piece of those plans. The timeline made one thing clear. My estate had never been an obstacle to the project. It had simply been a privately owned property that required a conversation instead of a demand. The county issued its decision later that afternoon. The development approval connected to my property was suspended until all required agreements were properly obtained. The HOA could no longer claim authority it did not have. The residents who had supported the expansion finally received the full story, and many expressed disappointment that they had not been shown all the details earlier. After the meeting, Victoria approached me and apologized for the way the situation had been handled. She explained that she believed she was protecting the community, but she understood now that protecting a community also meant respecting individual rights. I accepted her apology because the goal was never to embarrass anyone. The goal was simply to make sure the truth was recognized. A few weeks later, I returned to my lake estate and looked across the water that had caused so much disagreement. The property was still exactly where it had always been. The boundaries were still clear. The records had told the truth from the beginning. But before everything was completely finished, I received one more message from the county office. They wanted to discuss a new proposal. This time, they were not asking how to gain access to my property. They were asking how the community could move forward while respecting the rights that had been ignored for so long. The weeks after the county decision felt completely different from the months before it. For the first time, there were no unexpected notices, no assumptions about my property, and no one claiming authority they could not prove. The lake estate remained exactly as it had always been, protected by the same records that had existed for decades. The difference was that now everyone understood what those records meant. The county contacted me about a new proposal, but this time the conversation started with respect. They wanted to explore whether the community could create a future plan that worked with property owners instead of making decisions around them. I agreed to listen because I never believed growth was the problem. The problem was when people confused a vision with a right. During the meeting, several residents shared that they wished they had known the full story earlier. Many of them had supported the lake expansion because they believed it was already approved and legally secure. Once they saw the complete timeline, they realized they had only been given part of the information. That was an important lesson for everyone involved. A community is strongest when decisions are built on facts, not assumptions. Victoria Whitmore also changed after everything that happened. She stepped away from the leadership position and supported a new process for the HOA. She encouraged future board members to verify documents carefully before making decisions that affected other people's property. I appreciated that because accountability is not about finding someone to blame. It is about learning from mistakes and making sure they are not repeated. A few months later, I stood outside my home watching the sunset over the lake. I thought about the first day Victoria walked through my gate believing she had the power to remove me from my own estate. At that moment, she was confident because she trusted a story that had been repeated for years. But stories can change when the truth is finally examined. The most valuable thing I gained was not a legal victory or a public acknowledgement. It was the reminder that patience and preparation matter. When people challenge what you own, what you built, or what your family protected for generations, the strongest response is not anger. It is evidence. The records were there. The agreements were clear. The truth simply needed the opportunity to be heard. Looking back, I realized the conflict was never really about a lake estate or a development project. It was about the difference between influence and authority. The HOA had influence. They had plans. They had expectations. But they never had the right to decide what belonged to someone else. My family's property remained ours, the community found a better path forward, and everyone learned the same lesson. Respecting boundaries is not a barrier to progress. It is what makes progress possible. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room holds the one piece of information that changes everything.